Chapter 1. Mr. Bingley. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so decided in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of one or other of their daughters. Mrs. Bennet asked her husband one day, "Have you heard that there is now someone renting Netherfield Park?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." "Why, my dear, you should know that Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England." "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 pounds a year. What a fine thing for our girls." "How so?" "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no reason for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as beautiful as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you the best of the party." "My dear, you flatter me. But you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighborhood. It will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not." "There is no need for me to visit him. I am sure Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you. I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my approval of his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls. Though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie." "You will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half as beautiful as Jane, nor half as good-humored as Lydia. She is always your favorite." "They are all silly and ignorant, like other girls," he replied, "but Lizzie is quicker than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you talk of your children in such a way? You delight in making me angry. You do not care for my nerves." "You misunderstand me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them for the last 20 years at least, but I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 pounds a year move into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such men should come, since you will not visit them. I assure you, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all." Mr. Bennet was so odd a character that 23 years of marriage had not been long enough to make his wife understand him. Her mind was less complicated. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. She took comfort in visiting and news. When Mr. Bingley arrived, Mr. Bennet was one of the first to visit him. They all found out about his visit in the following manner. Observing his second daughter busy decorating a hat, he suddenly said, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We cannot know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother with a sigh, "as we cannot visit him." "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake," said Mrs. Bennet. "Please, think of my nerves. You tear them to pieces." "Kitty times her coughs very poorly," said her father. "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." "Yes, so it is," cried her mother. "But let us return to Mr. Bingley," said Mr. Bennet. "I am sick of Mr. Bingley," cried his wife. "I am sorry to hear that, but why didn't you tell me that before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he had wished, and that of Mrs. Bennet far exceeded the rest. Soon, though, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all along. "My dear Mr. Bennet, I knew you would. I was sure you loved your girls too much not to visit him. If I can see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," continued Mrs. Bennet to her husband, and all the others equally well married, I will have nothing to wish for." Mr. Bingley arrived at the ball 2 weeks later with his 2 sisters, the husband of the oldest and another young man. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant face and easy manners. His sisters were fine women with a fashionable air. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, simply looked the gentleman, but his friend Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall physique, handsome features, and the report of his having £10,000 a year. He was admired for about half the evening, till his manners turned the tide of his popularity. He was discovered to be proud, to be difficult to please. Not even his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him. Mr. Bingley was lively, and danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. What a contrast between him and his friend! Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, and spent the rest of the evening walking about the room. Elizabeth Bennet had found herself seated for 2 dances, and during part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley. "Come, Darcy," he said, "I must have you dance." "I certainly will not. There is not another woman in the room with whom it would not be a punishment to dance." "Upon my honor," cried Mr. Bingley, "I never met with so many pretty girls in my life as I have this evening." "You are dancing with the only pretty girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at Jane, who was the oldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever saw. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty." "Which do you mean?" he said, turning around to look for a moment at Elizabeth. "She is tolerable," he said coldly, "but not pretty enough to tempt me. I do not humor young ladies who cannot find anyone to dance with." Elizabeth later told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful personality. The evening passed well for the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her oldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most talented girl in the neighborhood, and Catherine and Lydia had never been without partners, which was all that they had yet learned to care for at a ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived. Later, when Jane and Elizabeth were alone, Jane told her sister just how very much she admired Mr. Bingley. "He is just what a young man ought to be," she said. "He is also handsome," replied Elizabeth. "I was very flattered by his asking me to dance a second time." "What could be more natural than his asking you again?" replied her sister. "He could not help seeing that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. Well, I give you permission to like him. You have liked many people who were more stupid than him." "Dear Lizzie!" "Oh, Jane, I never heard you speak badly of a human being in your life. And so you like this man's sisters, too, do you? Their manners are not equal to his. Not at first, but they are very nice women when you talk with them. Miss Bingley is to live with her brother and keep his house, and I think we will find her a charming neighbor." Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. They were very fine ladies, good-humored and agreeable when they chose to be so, but they were also proud. They were pretty, had been educated in one of the first private ladies' colleges in town, had a fortune of £20,000, were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and therefore thought well of themselves and meanly of others. Mr. Bingley inherited property to the amount of nearly £100,000 from his father, who had intended to purchase an estate but did not live to do it. Mr. Bingley intended to do the same, but as he was now renting a good house, most who knew him thought it likely that he would spend the remainder of his days at Netherfield. Between Bingley and Darcy there was a very steady friendship, in spite of great differences of character. At the ball, Bingley had never met with more pleasant people or prettier girls in his life. He had soon made friends with all in the room. As to Miss Bennet, he could not think of an angel more beautiful. Darcy, on the other hand, had seen a group of people in whom there was little beauty and no fashion. Miss Bennet he acknowledged to be pretty, but she smiled too much. Chapter 2. After the Ball. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived Sir William and Lady Lucas, with whom the Bennets were very friendly. They had several children. The oldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman, about 27, was Elizabeth's close friend. "Do not worry, Lizzie," said Charlotte Lucas. "Mr. Darcy is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite unlucky to be liked by him." Elizabeth was also worried about Mr. Bingley and Jane. It was clear whenever Bingley and her sister met that he did admire her. Jane kept her feelings to herself, though, and Elizabeth wondered if Bingley knew her sister's feelings. She mentioned it to her friend Charlotte. If a woman conceals her true feelings, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him, and it will have been no use at all. In 9 cases out of 10, a woman had better show more than she feels. But she does let him know, as much as she can. Bingley and Jane meet often enough, but it is always in large mixed parties. Jane should therefore make the most of every half hour in which she has his attention. If I were determined to get a rich husband, or any husband, I would adopt your plan, replied Elizabeth. But these are not Jane's feelings. She has known him only a fortnight. Occupied in discussing Mr. Bingley's feelings for her sister, Elizabeth did not notice that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Mr. Darcy had no sooner made it clear to himself and his friends that she hardly had a good feature in her face than he began to notice the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. After this discovery, he had several more. Her figure was light and pleasing, and he was caught by her easy playfulness. He began to wish to know more of her. Later the same evening, the group gathered to hear Mary play the piano. She had neither talent nor taste, but her sisters convinced her to play some lighter Scotch and Irish dances. Dancing began at the end of the room. "What a lovely way to pass the evening this is, Mr. Darcy," said Sir William to the young man. "Will you dance?" "No, certainly not," he replied. At that moment, Elizabeth moved toward them. Sir William called out to her, "My dear Miss Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you." And, taking her hand, he would have given it to Mr. Darcy, who, though extremely surprised, was not unwilling to receive it, when she instantly drew back. "Indeed, sir, I have not the least intention of dancing," she said, and walked away. Mr. Darcy was watching her leave as Miss Bingley approached him. "I can guess what you are thinking of," she said. "You are thinking about how terrible it would be to pass many evenings with these people, and indeed I agree with you. Your guess is wrong. I was actually thinking about a particular pair of fine eyes." Miss Bingley immediately looked at him. "And whose eyes might you be thinking of?" "Miss Elizabeth Bennet's." "Miss Elizabeth Bennet?" repeated Miss Bingley. "I am all astonishment. When can I congratulate you on your engagement?" She laughed loudly as she continued to tease him. The village of Longbourn was only 1 mile from Meryton, and the young ladies were usually tempted there 3 or 4 times a week to visit an aunt and also a hat shop. The 2 youngest of the family, Catherine and Lydia, made the trip more often than the rest. At present, they were very interested in the recent arrival of a group of soldiers in the neighborhood, who were to remain in Meryton the whole winter. Every day, their visits to their aunt added something to their knowledge of the officers' names and connections. They could talk of nothing but 2 things: officers and Mr. Bingley's large fortune. After listening one morning, Mr. Bennet coolly observed, "From all that I have heard, you must be 2 of the silliest girls in the country." "My dear Mr. Bennet," replied his wife, "I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself, and indeed I do still. And if a smart young colonel should want one of my girls, I will not say no to him." Mrs. Bennet was prevented from continuing by the arrival of a note for Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled with pleasure. "Well, Jane, what is it about? Hurry and tell us, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," said Jane, and then she read it aloud. "My dear friend, if you do not come to dine today with Louisa and me, we will be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, because if only Louisa and I spend a whole day together, we will have an argument before the day is over. Come as soon as you can on receipt of this. My brother and the gentlemen are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." "Dining out," said Mrs. Bennet. "That is very unlucky." "Can I have the carriage?" said Jane. "No, my dear. You had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night." "I would rather take the carriage." Her mother would not hear of it, and soon after Jane left on horseback. Mrs. Bennet's hopes were answered. Jane had not been gone long before it rained hard. Her sisters were worried for her, but her mother was delighted. The rain continued the whole evening without stopping. Jane certainly could not come back. The next morning, a servant from Netherfield brought the following note for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie, I am very unwell this morning, probably because I became quite wet in the rain yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning till I am better. However, apart from a sore throat and a headache, I am fine. Yours, Jane." Elizabeth, very worried, decided to walk to Netherfield to see her. She walked alone, crossing field after field, jumping over puddles and finding herself at last at the house with tired ankles, dirty stockings, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise. Her appearance created a great deal of surprise. The fact that she walked 3 miles so early in the day, in such dirty weather and by herself, was almost incredible to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst said nothing at all. The former admired her glowing face, while the latter was thinking only of his breakfast. She soon learned that Jane had not slept well and was not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth sat by her silently. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. Jane did not want her to, however, and soon Elizabeth accepted Miss Bingley's offer of a room for the night. A servant was sent to Longbourn to tell the family and to bring back some clothes. When dinner was over, Elizabeth returned directly to Jane. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst began talking about her as soon as she was out of the room. "There is nothing good about her, except that she is an excellent walker," said Mrs. Hurst. "I will never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild." "She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly control myself. Why must she be running about the country? Because her sister had a cold? And her hair! Yes, and her dress. Did you see it? 6 inches deep in mud, I am sure." "Well, Louisa," said Bingley, "I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning." "What about you, Mr. Darcy?" asked Miss Bingley in a half-whisper. "Has this affected your admiration of her fine eyes?" "Not at all," he replied. "They were brightened by the exercise." Elizabeth joined them again only to say that her sister was worse, and that she could not leave her. It was decided that Mr. Jones, the doctor, should be sent for early in the morning. Elizabeth passed most of the night in her sister's room, and in the morning, Jane seemed to be a little better. She sent for her mother, who arrived soon after. "Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. She is too ill," Mrs. Bennet told Bingley. "We must ask for your kindness a little longer." "Moved?" cried Bingley. "It must not be thought of." Mrs. Bennet thanked him. "How lucky we are to have such good neighbors." Lydia, her second youngest daughter, suddenly put herself forward to ask Mr. Bingley to keep his promise on giving a ball at Netherfield. Lydia was a short, well-built girl of 15, with fine skin and a pretty smile, a favorite with her mother. Mr. Bingley's answer to her sudden attack was delightful to their mother's ear. "I am perfectly ready to keep my promise, and when your sister is well again, we will have a ball." Mrs. Bennet and her daughters then returned home, and Elizabeth returned instantly to Jane, leaving her own and her relations' behavior to be talked about by the two ladies. Chapter 3. Pride and Prejudice. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with Jane, who continued, though slowly, to get better. In the evening, Elizabeth joined the group near the fire. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching him write. Elizabeth took up some needlework and listened to what passed between Darcy and Miss Bingley. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter," said Miss Bingley. He made no answer. "You write very fast." "You are mistaken. I write rather slowly." "Tell your sister that I want to see her." "I have already told her so once." "Let me fix your pen for you." "Thank you, but I can fix it myself." "But do you always write such charming, long letters to your sister, Mr. Darcy?" "They are generally long, but whether always charming I do not know." "I think you write far better than my brother," cried Miss Bingley. "Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable." "My ideas flow so rapidly that I do not have time to express them," replied Bingley. "Bingley, you are really proud of your poor writing," said Darcy, "because you think it demonstrates quick thinking, which, if not ideal, you think at least highly interesting." "Well," cried Elizabeth, "I think that is a sign of a good character indeed." "I thank you," said Bingley, "for turning my friend's words into a compliment, for that is not what he meant by them. Now, let us play some cards." "I see what you are doing, Bingley," said his friend. "You dislike an argument and want to silence this." "Perhaps I do. If you and Miss Bennet will wait until I am out of the room, I will be very thankful." "What you ask," said Elizabeth, "is fine with me." And Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter. Mr. Darcy took her advice and did finish his letter. When that business was over, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for some music. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley began a lively Scotch air, and soon afterward, Mr. Darcy, drawing near Elizabeth, said to her, "Do you not feel like dancing, Miss Bennet?" "Oh," she said with a smile, "you want me, I know, to say yes, so that you can have the pleasure of laughing at my taste. I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance at all." "Oh," said Mr. Darcy. He realized he had never been this interested in any woman as he was in her. He began to think he might be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough to be jealous. She tried to tease Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage and planning his happiness. "I hope," she said, as they were walking together the next day, "you will tell your mother-in-law when you and Elizabeth are married to be a little quieter, and, if you can, to stop the younger girls running after officers. You can hang their pictures on the wall at Pemberley. Of course, no picture will be able to truly show your love's beautiful eyes." At that moment, they were met by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. Taking Darcy's other arm, Mrs. Hurst joined them and left Elizabeth to walk behind by herself. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go into the avenue." "No, no, stay where you are," replied Elizabeth with a laugh. She did not want to stay with them and soon ran off. She wanted to go home as soon as possible. That evening after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister and, seeing that she was looking well, brought her into the room where the two ladies sat. Her two friends welcomed her with pleasure, and Elizabeth had never seen them so friendly as they were during the hour which passed before the gentleman appeared. But when the gentleman entered, Jane was no longer the most important. Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned toward Darcy, and she had something to say to him, before he had even sat down. Mr. Bingley was full of joy and attention for Jane. The first half-hour was spent in piling up the fire to keep her warm. He then sat down by her and did not talk to anyone else. Elizabeth, at work in the opposite corner, saw it all with great delight. When tea was over, they all sat near the fire. Darcy took up a book, Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. Miss Bingley watched Mr. Darcy as he read, making comments. He did not pay her any attention. She yawned, threw aside her book, and looked around the room for some amusement. Hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly toward him and said, "Charles, are you really serious about holding a dance at Netherfield? Please, I am sure there are some among us for whom a ball would be more of a punishment than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," cried her brother, "he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins. But as for the ball, I have already decided." Miss Bingley made no answer, and soon afterward she got up and walked about the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, paid no attention. Turning to Elizabeth, she said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, won't you walk around the room with me?" Elizabeth was surprised, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded. Mr. Darcy looked up and closed his book without thinking. Miss Bingley asked him to join them, but he refused. "I feel you either choose to walk up and down because you have secret affairs to discuss, or because you know that your figures look best when walking. If it is the first, I would be completely in your way, and if it is the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire." "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley. "I would laugh, but Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at," cried Elizabeth. "It is a shame, for I dearly love a laugh." The wisest and the best of men become silly when their first object in life is a joke. "Certainly," replied Elizabeth, "but I do not laugh at what is wise and good. It has been the study of my life to avoid such weaknesses which might make people laugh at me." "Such as vanity and pride? Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride is not always bad." Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. "Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume," said Miss Bingley. "Do tell us. What is the result?" "It seems that Mr. Darcy has no weaknesses at all," replied Elizabeth, with a smile. "That is not true," said Darcy, not understanding the joke. "There is, I believe, some evil in every person, which cannot be overcome." "Then your weakness is to hate everybody," said Lizzie. "And yours," he replied with a smile, "is to misunderstand them." "Do let us have a little music," cried Miss Bingley, who had grown tired of this conversation that did not include her. Elizabeth and Jane decided that they should leave Netherfield the next day. They wrote to their mother, who felt they should stay at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, and would not let them have the carriage before that time. Elizabeth then encouraged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, which she did. Mr. Darcy was pleased to hear that the Miss Bennets were returning home. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked. He decided to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him. In this way, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of Saturday. On Sunday, the young ladies returned home. They were not welcomed home very warmly by their mother, but their father, though he did not say it, was most glad to see them. The evening conversation had lost much of its liveliness, and almost all its sense, by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. Chapter 4. Mr. Collins. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife as they were at breakfast the next morning, "that you have ordered a good dinner today, because we will have a guest." Mrs. Bennet's eyes lit up. "It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure." "It is not Mr. Bingley," said her husband. "It is a person I have never met before in my life." He then explained, "About a month ago, I received this letter. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, is to receive this house and may turn you all out of it as soon as he pleases." "Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "do not talk of that man. I think it is terrible for him to write to you at all. Why could he not keep on arguing with you as his father did before him?" "Well, it seems he wants to apologize for his father's behavior. He will be working for the church in this area at the request of his patroness, someone called Lady Catherine de Bourgh. He wishes to come and stay with us for a week as a sort of peace offering. So he will be here at 4 o'clock, said Mr. Bennet as he folded up the letter. Mr. Collins arrived on time. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. He complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, said he had heard much of their beauty, and added that he would like to see them all married in time. "You are very kind," replied Mrs. Bennet, "and I wish with all my heart it may be so, for otherwise they will be very poor and homeless." After dinner, Mr. Bennet asked Mr. Collins about his patroness. Mr. Collins said that he had never in his life seen such generous behavior in a person of Lady Catherine's importance. "Well," said Mrs. Bennet, "does she have any family?" "She has only one daughter." "Ah," said Mrs. Bennet, "and what sort of young lady is she? Is she pretty?" "Oh, yes. She is, unfortunately, a sickly young lady, but I have always told Lady Catherine that she has the look of royalty. Lady Catherine likes it when I say such things." "Oh, I am sure she does," said Mr. Bennet, smiling. His cousin was as peculiar as he had hoped, and he found him very entertaining. By tea-time, however, he had had enough of him, and so invited him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins began to read a very serious passage. Lydia's mouth opened, and as he finished reading the 3rd page, she interrupted him. "Mamma, I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about the officers and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Mr. Collins, much offended, put down his book. Mr. Collins had little education and no social charms. Meeting Lady Catherine de Bourgh had been a fortunate thing, for now he had a good house and a sufficient income. Mr. Collins now intended to marry, and in seeking to reconcile with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view as he meant to choose one of the daughters. After seeing Miss Bennet's lovely face, he decided that she was the one. After talking with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast the next day, however, he discovered that she was soon to become engaged. He then decided on Lizzie, who was second to her sister in birth and beauty. That day, all the sisters except Mary walked to Meryton with Lydia. Mr. Collins went with them at Mr. Bennet's encouragement. Arriving in Meryton, the eyes of the younger girls wandered in search of the officers, and only a very pretty dress in a shop window could turn their heads. Soon after, all the young ladies noticed a young man of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with another officer, Mr. Denny. Mr. Denny introduced them to his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town. He was very handsome and very charming. The whole party was still standing and talking together when the sound of horses turned their heads, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. Bingley rode up to them with a smile, while Darcy was trying hard not to look at Elizabeth. Suddenly, Darcy noticed the stranger. Elizabeth saw a strange look pass between them. Both changed color. One looked white, the other red. What could be the meaning of it? In another minute, the two men rode on. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and tried to do whatever she could to make them happy. At the request of Lydia and Kitty, she promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation to the dinner they planned to hold the next day. The next evening, a coach took Mr. Collins and his 5 cousins to Meryton for dinner at the Phillips. The women were seated when the officers walked in. Mr. Wickham was the happy man toward whom almost every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the happy woman by whom he finally seated himself. She quickly found that he was very easy to talk to. Mr. Wickham soon began talking about the one thing Lizzie dared not ask him. He asked how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and after receiving her answer, asked how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," said Elizabeth. "You must know, Miss Bennet, that I have been connected with his family since I was a child." Elizabeth could not help but look surprised. "You may have noticed our cold greeting yesterday. Do you know Mr. Darcy well?" "As much as I ever wish to," cried Elizabeth. "He is not at all liked in this area." "I cannot pretend to be sorry," said Wickham. After a pause, he said, "I wonder whether he is likely to be in this country much longer." "I do not at all know. I hope your plans will not be affected by his being in the neighborhood." "Oh, no, I will not be driven away by Mr. Darcy. We are not on friendly terms, but I have no reason for avoiding him." His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had. Whenever I am near Mr. Darcy, many sad memories return to me. Elizabeth was very interested in what he was saying, but did not want to ask too many questions. You know, Miss Bennet, a military life is not what I was intended for. I would now be employed by the church if it were not for the gentleman we were just speaking of. He did not allow me the money that was to be mine following the death of his father. Good heavens! Cried Elizabeth. But how could that be? Mr. Darcy chose not to give me the gift his father left me. I do not know why. But the fact is, we are very different men, and he hates me. I cannot say anything against him publicly, as it would be disrespectful to his father. Elizabeth thought him handsomer than ever as he expressed these feelings. But what, she said, after a pause, could have caused him to behave this way? I think he may be jealous of me. His father loved me very much. It is a shame, as we were born nearby, and we played together as children. Immediately before my father's death, the older Mr. Darcy made him promise to provide for me. So he is disrespecting his father's wishes, cried Elizabeth. How proud he is! Yes, said Wickham. Pride has often been his best friend. He is proud of his rich family, and is especially proud of his younger sister. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. She is too much like her brother. Very, very proud. As a child, we often played together, but she is nothing to me now. She is a pretty girl, about 15 or 16. Since her father's death, her home has been in London. They soon noticed that the game of cards in the other corner had finished, and that Mr. Collins appeared to have lost some money. Thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, he said, I have no need to worry about the loss of 5 shillings. Mr. Wickham looked at him, and then said to Elizabeth in a low voice, You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, so, as a result, Lady Catherine is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy. No, I did not. It is thought that her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will marry Mr. Darcy. This information made Elizabeth smile as she thought of poor Miss Bingley, and all her efforts to gain his attention. Mr. Collins, she said, speaks highly of both Lady Catherine and her daughter, but from some of his stories, I gather that she must be quite an arrogant woman. Yes, I believe you are right, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her. They continued talking together until supper put an end to cards, and then she gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. They all liked him very much, and Elizabeth left the party with her head full of him. Chapter 5. The Netherfield Ball. The following Tuesday was the Netherfield Ball. Lizzie arrived at Netherfield and excitedly looked for Mr. Wickham among the red coats, but could not see him. Mr. Denny soon told them that Wickham had gone to town on business the day before, adding with a smile, I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now if he had not wanted to avoid a certain gentleman here. This information assured Elizabeth that Darcy was certainly responsible for Wickham's absence, and increased her feelings of displeasure against him. But Elizabeth did not stay unhappy all evening, and having told all her problems to Charlotte Lucas, she soon joined the dancing. The first 2 dances, however, brought a return of unhappiness. She danced then with Mr. Collins. Awkward and serious, he was a terrible dance partner. She danced next with an officer and learned from him that Wickham was universally liked. When those dances were over, she was returning to Charlotte Lucas when suddenly Mr. Darcy asked her to dance. He took her so much by surprise that, without knowing what she did, she accepted. They stood for some time in line with the other couples without speaking a word. To break the silence, she made a comment on the dance. He replied and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she said, It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. He smiled. Then he asked her if she and her sisters often walked to Meryton. She replied and then added, When you met us there the other day, we had just made a new friend." Darcy turned red. After a while he said, "Mr. Wickham is able to make friends easily, but whether he can keep them is less certain." "He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship," replied Elizabeth, "and will suffer for it all his life." Darcy made no answer, and seemed to want to change the subject. At that moment, Sir William Lucas appeared close to them. "My dear Eliza," he said with a smile, "it seems that the happy event," and here he looked at his sister and Bingley, "will soon take place." Darcy seemed not to hear him. When Sir William walked away, he said, "I cannot remember what we were talking of." "I do not think we were speaking at all. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success. And what are we to talk of next, I cannot imagine." "What do you think of books?" he said, smiling. "Books. I cannot talk of books in a ballroom. But I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgive someone who has displeased you. Is that true?" "Yes," he said with a firm voice. "And you never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice?" "I hope not. But why do you ask?" "I am trying to make out your character." "And are you successful?" She shook her head. "I hear such different things about you that I am quite puzzled." "That," he answered seriously, "I can believe." When he moved away, Miss Bingley came toward her. "So, Miss Eliza, I hear that you are quite delighted with George Wickham." "Well, let me tell you as a friend, not to believe everything he tells you. Mr. Darcy has not treated him badly at all. In fact, he has always been very kind to him." "How dare she?" thought Lizzie. She went to find Jane. "Have you learned anything about Mr. Wickham?" she asked her sister. "Or have you been having too much fun to think of any third person?" "No," replied Jane. "I have not forgotten him. Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham's whole history, but says that he is not a respectable young man." "Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself?" "No, he never saw him till the other morning at Meryton." "Then that is just Mr. Darcy's opinion." Elizabeth moved to talk to Miss Lucas. Mr. Collins came up to them very excited. "I have found out," he said, "that there is now in the room a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I must go and talk to him." "You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy?" "Indeed I am. My dear Miss Elizabeth, you must understand that in this case I consider myself in a better position to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself." And with a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy, while Lizzie watched closely. Mr. Darcy was clearly very surprised and not at all happy to meet her cousin. To Elizabeth, it appeared that if her family had made an agreement to embarrass themselves as much as they could during the evening, it would have been impossible for them to do any better. Her mother spoke of Bingley and Jane in a loud voice to anyone and everyone, while her sister Mary sang not 1, but 2 painful songs. The fact that the 2 Miss Bingleys and Mr. Darcy had such an opportunity of ridiculing her relations made Lizzie quite angry. Mrs. Bennet left Netherfield that evening with great confidence that her oldest daughter would soon be living there. As for another daughter marrying Mr. Collins, she thought of this with equal confidence. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children, and she thought the man and the match were quite good enough for her. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins decided that he should propose to Elizabeth as soon as possible. In this businesslike manner, on finding Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together soon after breakfast, he said to Mrs. Bennet, "May I hope, madam, for your approval when I ask for some time alone with your fair daughter Elizabeth this morning?" Before Elizabeth had time to say anything, Mrs. Bennet answered, "Yes, of course. I am sure Lizzie will be very happy. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs." As she rushed to leave the room, Elizabeth called out, "Mamma, do not go. Mr. Collins can have nothing to say to me that anybody does not need to hear." "No, Lizzie, stay where you are," said her mother. Deciding that it would be wisest to get it over as soon and as quietly as possible, Elizabeth sat down again. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and as soon as they were gone, Mr. Collins began. My dear Miss Elizabeth, almost as soon as I entered this house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. Elizabeth felt like laughing, but she did not. My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for a man of the church to set a good example. Secondly, I think it will make me happy. And thirdly, it is the advice of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. There are many lovely young women in my own neighborhood, but I have chosen you because, as you know, I am to inherit this estate after the death of your great father, who, however, may live many years longer. Good sir, she cried, you forget that I have made no answer. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me, but I cannot marry you. Yes, replied Mr. Collins, with a wave of the hand. I know that it is not unusual for young ladies to reject the proposal of the man whom they secretly mean to accept. No, sir, cried Elizabeth, I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so. Well, when I next have the chance of speaking to you on the subject, I hope I will receive a more favorable answer. Really, Mr. Collins, cried Elizabeth, you puzzle me. If what I have just said can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I do not know how to express my refusal. Elizabeth did not know what more to say to someone so set on self-deception, and immediately and in silence left the room. Mr. Collins was not left alone for long before Mrs. Bennet rushed in. She noticed his serious face immediately. "Oh, Mr. Collins," she said, "I will speak to Lizzie about it directly." She ran to her husband and called out as she entered the library, "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she says she will not have him, and if you do not hurry, he will change his mind and not have her." Mr. Bennet raised his eyes from his book. "Bring Lizzie down. She will hear my opinion. Come here, child," began her father as she appeared. "I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is it true?" Elizabeth replied that it was. "Very well. And you have refused?" "I have, sir." "Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother tells you to accept it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I will never see her again." "Well, Elizabeth, from this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth could not help but smile. "Now, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife, "I would like to have my library to myself as soon as possible." "I tell you, Miss Lizzie," said Mrs. Bennet to her daughter, "if you go on refusing every offer of marriage in this way, you will never get a husband at all, and I am sure I do not know how I will keep you when your father is dead. Oh, my nerves!" Chapter 6. The Proposal. The discussion of Mr. Collins' offer was now nearly at an end. Mr. Collins now hardly spoke to Elizabeth, and, to her relief, instead talked to Miss Lucas, who very kindly listened to him all afternoon. After breakfast the next day, the girls walked to Meryton to see if Mr. Wickham had returned, and to tell him how disappointed they were at his absence from the Netherfield ball. He joined them as they entered town, and went with them to their aunt's house. "I found," he said quietly to Elizabeth, "as the time drew near, that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy. To be in the same room, the same party, with him might be more than I could bear." Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant paper covered with a lady's handwriting. Elizabeth saw her sister's face change as she read it. Later, when they were alone, Jane showed her the letter. "This is from Caroline Bingley. What it says has surprised me very much. The whole party has left Netherfield, and are on their way to town, and will not be coming back." Elizabeth was also very surprised. After a moment she said, "Well, it is unlucky that we will not see any more of the sisters." Do not worry, Jane. I am sure Mr. Bingley will return to the house. No, Lizzie. It says here that none of the party will return this winter. I will read it to you. My brother has very important business in town that we are sure will take a long time to finish, and we are at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town, he will be in no hurry to leave again. I hope your Christmas will be a happy one, and that there will be many young men around to prevent you feeling the loss of the 3 we take with us. From this, added Jane, it is clear that he will not come back this winter. No, it is only clear that Miss Bingley does not want him to. There is more, Lizzie. Listen to this. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and so are we. I really do not think there is anyone more beautiful or elegant than Georgiana Darcy, and I do not know if I have told you this before, but we have the hope that she might one day be our sister. My brother will now be able to meet with her often, and we think they are an excellent match. Oh, Jane, can't you see? Said Lizzie. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you, and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in hope of keeping him there, and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you. Jane shook her head. No, she has always been so kind to me. I cannot believe that she would do that. Of course, you must believe everyone to be good and kind. Well, do what you must. I know what I think. The next day the Bennets made plans to dine with the Lucases. Again, for much of the day, Miss Lucas was so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. Charlotte told her friend that she did not mind, but her kindness went further than Elizabeth could imagine. Charlotte had the intention of turning Mr. Collins's attention toward herself. She was successful. The next morning Mr. Collins left Longbourn House very early, and rushed to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. She accepted him immediately. In as short a time as Mr. Collins's long speeches would allow, everything was settled between them. Miss Lucas, who accepted him only because she felt the need to secure a husband, did not care when their wedding took place. Sir William and Lady Lucas were very happy with the match. Mr. Collins's wealth made him an excellent match for their daughter, to whom they could give little. But even with this lack of resources, Mr. Collins still wanted to be her husband. She knew a good marriage was the only path for an educated woman with little money, and at the age of 27, without having ever been beautiful, she felt lucky. The worst part of it was the surprise it would give to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she valued beyond that of any other person. Mr. Collins said goodbye to the Bennets that evening. Mrs. Bennet, with great politeness, said how happy they should be to see him at Longbourn again, whenever he might be in the area. Well, he replied, I was hoping you would ask me, and you may be very certain that I will be back as soon as possible. They were all surprised, and Mr. Bennet, who was not in a hurry for him to return, immediately said, But don't you need to return to Lady Catherine for a while? You do not want to neglect her. You really cannot be too careful. If you must stay at home, we will not be offended. Mr. Collins left soon after wishing all of them, even Elizabeth, a warm goodbye. The family did not understand why he would want to return so soon. On the following morning, Elizabeth found out. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast and, in a private conversation, told her what had happened the day before. Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible. Miss Lucas calmly replied, My dear Eliza, I see what you are feeling. You must be surprised, as Mr. Collins was very recently wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, you know. I only ask for a comfortable home. My chance of happiness with him is as good as the happiness of most people who decide to get married. The strangeness of Mr. Collins's making 2 offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison to his being now accepted. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins. Elizabeth could not help but think differently of her friend, who had sacrificed her happiness for money. Mrs. Bennet could not believe the match. She realized that after Mr. Bennet died, their house would now become the property of Charlotte Lucas. If only Lizzie had accepted him first. A week passed before she could see Elizabeth without being angry at her. A month passed away before she could speak to Sir William or Lady Lucas without being rude. and many months were gone before she could at all forgive their daughter. Lady Lucas was pleased to find that, unlike Mrs. Bennet, she now had the comfort of one daughter well married. She called at Longbourn often to say how happy she was. Between Elizabeth and Charlotte there was silence on the subject, and Elizabeth felt that they would never be close again. Her disappointment in Charlotte made her turn to her sister, for whose happiness she grew daily more anxious, as Bingley had now been gone a week, and nothing more was heard of his return. A week passed, and finally Miss Bingley's letter arrived, and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence told her they were all settled in London for the winter, and the letter ended with her brother's apologies for not having time to say goodbye. The letter was full of praise for Miss Darcy, and spoke of an increasing friendship between the young lady and Caroline's brother, who was staying at Mr. Darcy's house. Jane told Elizabeth about the letter. Elizabeth asked her if it was true. "Beyond a doubt, Lizzie," said Jane. "They do wish him to choose Miss Darcy," replied Jane. "They have known her much longer than they have known me. It's no wonder if they love her better. But, whatever may be their own wishes, it is very unlikely they would go against their brother's. What sister would think she could change her brother's mind? It must be true that he does not have feelings for me." Mr. Wickham's friendship was very helpful in removing some of the gloom which had fallen on many of the Longbourn family. They saw him often and liked him very much. They now all knew the things Mr. Darcy had done to him, and everybody was pleased to know how much they had always disliked Mr. Darcy before they had known anything of the matter. All but Jane now thought of him as the worst of men. Chapter 7. Mrs. Collins. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet welcomed her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, well-educated man. Mrs. Gardiner was younger and a friendly and elegant woman, and a great favorite with all her Longbourn nieces. Between the two oldest and herself, especially, there was a particular friendship, and they often stayed with her in town. The first part of Mrs. Gardiner's business on her arrival was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. Then it became her turn to listen. Mrs. Bennet had much to complain of. 2 of her girls had been upon the point of marriage, and, after all, nothing had happened. "I do not blame Jane," she continued, "for Jane would have got Mr. Bingley if she could. But Lizzie, oh, sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins's wife by this time, if it had not been for her own mistakes. He made her an offer in this very room, and she refused him." When alone with Elizabeth afterward, Mrs. Gardiner spoke more about Jane. "A young man such as you describe Mr. Bingley so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks and then forgets her. But you should have seen him. He could hardly talk to anyone else, and at his own ball he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance. Oh, poor Jane. I am sorry for her. Do you think she would like to go back with us to town? A change of scene might be a good thing. But I hope," added Mrs. Gardiner, "that this young man will not influence her. We live in so different a part of town, and we go out very little, so it is very unlikely that they should meet at all, unless he comes to see her." Of course, Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure. The Gardiners stayed a week at Longbourn, and what with the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers, there was not a day without entertainment. When they were at home, some of the officers always joined them, especially Mr. Wickham, and Mrs. Gardiner watched him and Elizabeth closely. She quickly noticed they were clearly interested in each other, and she decided to speak to Elizabeth on the subject before she left Hertfordshire. "Lizzie, you must be careful. Do not involve yourself with a man without any fortune. I have nothing to say against him. He is a most interesting young man, but, as it is, you must not disappoint your father." "My dear aunt, I will take care of myself, and of Mr. Wickham too. He will not fall in love with me if I can prevent it." Thursday was to be the wedding day for Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas, and on Wednesday Miss Lucas came to say goodbye. "Eliza, I have a favor to ask you," she said. "Will you come and see me?" Elizabeth could not refuse, though she did not really want to go. My father and Maria are coming to me in March," added Charlotte. "I hope you will join them." The wedding took place, and the bride and bridegroom set off for Kent. Elizabeth soon heard from her friend. Charlotte wrote that the house, furniture, neighborhood, and roads were all lovely, and Lady Catherine's behavior was most friendly. It sounded exactly like Mr. Collins' picture of Hunsford, and Elizabeth realized that she must wait for her own visit there to know the rest. Jane had already written a few lines to her sister to announce their safe arrival in London. When she wrote again, she said that she had been a week in town without either seeing or hearing from Caroline Bingley. She thought that perhaps her last letter to her friend had been lost. "My aunt," she continued, "is going tomorrow into that part of town, and I will take the opportunity of calling in Grosvenor Street." She wrote again when the visit was paid, and she had seen Miss Bingley. "Caroline told me she did not know I was in London. I was right, therefore, that my last letter had never reached her. I asked after their brother, of course. He was well, but so busy with Mr. Darcy that they hardly ever saw him. They told me that Miss Darcy was expected to dinner. I wish I could see her. My visit was not long, as Caroline and Mrs. Hurst were going out. I hope they will visit me soon here." Elizabeth was convinced that only an accident could make Mr. Bingley discover that her sister was in town. 4 weeks passed, and Jane saw nothing of him. She could no longer be blind to Miss Bingley's feelings toward her. After waiting at home every morning for a fortnight, she did at last see her, but her short stay and her formal manner told Jane everything. Jane soon wrote to tell Elizabeth. "Lizzie," the letter read, "I am now sure that Caroline does not think of me as a friend. Not only this, but all expectation from the brother was now absolutely over." About this time, much to Mrs. Gardiner's relief, Mr. Wickham stopped paying Lizzie attention. He had found someone else. A young lady, a Miss King, had suddenly received £10,000 and had since become extremely attractive to Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth was only slightly hurt and wished him happiness. Telling this story to Mrs. Gardiner, she said, "I am now convinced that I have never been much in love, for if I had really loved Mr. Wickham, I am sure I would hate his very name. But I do not feel that way at all. I cannot deny the fact that even handsome young men need some money to live on." January and February passed by, and March arrived to take Elizabeth to Hunsford. After a long winter with her mother and sisters, she had started to think that a change might be for the better. The journey would also allow her to see Jane, as they would stop in London for one night. It was soon decided, and she set out on the journey with Sir William and his second daughter. They arrived in Gracechurch Street at noon. As they drove to Mr. Gardiner's door, Jane was at a window watching their arrival. Elizabeth was pleased to see she looked as healthy and lovely as ever. The day passed most pleasantly, the morning in shopping, and the evening at one of the theaters. The next morning they traveled on to Hunsford. After a long time they turned down a narrow road toward the house. Mr. Collins and Charlotte soon appeared at the door. Mrs. Collins welcomed her friend warmly. Elizabeth saw instantly that her cousin's manners were not changed by his marriage. He was as formal as ever. Elizabeth could not help thinking that when he showed them his house, its view and lovely furniture, he was actually speaking to her, as if wishing to make her see what she had lost in refusing him. She was in wonder at Charlotte, and the way she did not seem to notice the embarrassing things her husband often said. Soon Mr. Collins invited them to take a walk in the large garden, which he cared for himself. Charlotte told her she encouraged him to leave the house to garden as often as possible for his health. "Miss Elizabeth," said Mr. Collins, "you will have the honor of seeing Lady Catherine de Bourgh next Sunday at church, and I am sure you will be delighted with her. We dine at Rosings twice every week, and are never allowed to walk home. Her ladyship's carriage is ordered for us. I should say one of her ladyship's carriages, for she has several. Lady Catherine is a very good neighbor," added Charlotte. About the middle of the next day, as she was in her room getting ready for a walk, a sudden noise below sent the whole house into confusion. Following Sir William's daughter Maria downstairs, they rushed to a window to see what the trouble was. It was two ladies stopping in a low carriage at the garden gate. "And is this all?" cried Elizabeth. "I had expected at least the pigs were in the garden, and here is nothing but Lady Catherine and her daughter." "No, my dear," said Maria. "It is not Lady Catherine. The old lady is Mrs. Jenkinson, who lives with them. The other is Miss de Bourgh. Only, look at her. She is quite a little creature. Who would have thought that she could be so thin and small?" "I like her appearance," said Elizabeth, thinking of something else. "She looks sickly and cross. Yes, she will do for him very well. She will make him a very good wife." Mr. Collins and Charlotte were both standing at the gate in conversation with the ladies. After a while, the ladies drove on, and Mr. Collins began to congratulate the girls on their good fortune. Since Elizabeth did not understand what Mr. Collins was referring to, Charlotte explained by letting her know that the whole party was asked to dine at Rosings the next day. Chapter 8. The Holiday. Scarcely anything was talked of the whole day or next morning but their visit to Rosings. Mr. Collins was carefully instructing them in what they might expect. To Elizabeth he said, "Do not worry, my dear cousin, about your clothing. Lady Catherine does not expect you to dress as elegantly as she does." As the weather was fine, they had a pleasant walk across the park. Elizabeth saw much to be pleased with, though she could not be as excited as Mr. Collins expected her to be. Finally, they entered the room where Lady Catherine, her daughter, and Mrs. Jenkinson were sitting. Lady Catherine rose to meet them, and they had a formal introduction. Lady Catherine was a tall, large woman with strong features. She was not at all friendly. Elizabeth felt that Mr. Wickham's description of her had been perfectly accurate. After examining the mother, she turned her eyes on the daughter. Miss de Bourgh was thin, pale, and small, and she spoke very little, except in a low voice to Mrs. Jenkinson. The dinner was very fancy, and Mr. Collins took his seat at the bottom of the table, looking as if he felt that life could give him nothing more. There was very little conversation. After dinner, Lady Catherine talked without pause until coffee came in, giving her opinion on every subject. She gave Charlotte advice on how to care for her cows and chickens. She asked Elizabeth many questions: how many sisters she had, whether any of them were likely to be married, where they had been educated, and what had been her mother's maiden name. Then she asked, "Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet?" "A little." "Do your sisters play and sing?" "One of them does." "You should have all learned." "Do you draw?" "No, not at all." "What, none of you? Not one? That is very strange. Tell me, what is your age?" "With 3 younger sisters grown up," replied Elizabeth, smiling, "you can hardly expect me to say." Lady Catherine seemed quite surprised, and Elizabeth suspected she was the first person who had ever failed to answer her directly. "You cannot be more than 20, so you can say your age." "I am not yet 21. They left the house after a game of cards, and as soon as they had driven from the door, Elizabeth was called on by her cousin to give her opinion of all that she had seen at Rosings, which, for Charlotte's sake, she made more favorable than it really was. Sir William stayed only a week at Hunsford, long enough to convince him that his daughter was comfortably settled. After he left, Elizabeth and Maria were invited to dine at Rosings about twice a week. The weather was so fine for the time of year that Elizabeth often took walks outdoors. She loved to walk along the park, and often went there while the others would visit Lady Catherine. The first fortnight of her visit soon passed. Easter was approaching, and soon they learned Mr. Darcy would be arriving at Rosings. Although there were many people Elizabeth would have preferred to spend time with, his coming would be a refreshing addition to their dinners at Rosings. Mr. Darcy arrived one morning, bringing with him his cousin, a Colonel Fitzwilliam. When Mr. Collins returned from Rosings, the 2 gentlemen came with him. Charlotte had seen them from her husband's room, and said, "I can thank you, Eliza, for this visit. Mr. Darcy would never have come so soon to visit me." Elizabeth scarcely had time to deny this when the 3 men walked in. Colonel Fitzwilliam was about 30, not handsome, but a true gentleman. Colonel Fitzwilliam talked very pleasantly, but his cousin sat for some time without speaking to anybody. At length, he asked Elizabeth about the health of her family. She answered him in the usual way, and then added, "My oldest sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you seen her?" She knew that he had not, but she wished to see whether he would say anything of what had passed between the Bingleys and Jane, and she thought he looked a little confused as he answered. Soon afterward, the gentleman went away. While there were visitors at Rosings, their company was not needed, and so it was almost a week after the gentleman's arrival that they were asked to the house. This time, Lady Catherine's attention was focused almost entirely on her 2 nephews, especially Mr. Darcy. Colonel Fitzwilliam seemed really happy to see them, and he was very interested in Mrs. Collins's pretty friend. He now sat by her and began such an entertaining conversation that soon Lady Catherine's attention was drawn to them. She called out, "What is that you are saying, Fitzwilliam? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." "We are speaking of music," he said. "Of music? Then do speak up. There are few people in England who enjoy music more than myself." When coffee was over, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of her promise to play to him, and she sat down at the piano. He drew a chair near her. Mr. Darcy also moved nearer to the piano. Elizabeth turned to him with a smile and said, "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy. It will not work. My courage always rises at every attempt to intimidate me. I have known you long enough to know that you sometimes like to say things that you do not mean," he replied with a smile. Elizabeth laughed and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "I am so unlucky to have met someone who can tell you my true character. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, you should be careful that you do not encourage me to say things about you." "I am not afraid of you," he said. "Tell me what you have to say," cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I would like to know how he behaves among strangers." "Well, the first time I ever saw him was at a ball, and he danced only 4 dances, even though more than one young lady was sitting down without a partner. I did not, at that time, know any lady beyond my party." "True, and it is so difficult to meet people at a ball." "Perhaps," said Darcy, smiling. "I should have judged better, but I am not very good at introducing myself to strangers." Soon Lady Catherine approached, and, after listening for a few minutes, said to Darcy, "Miss Bennet would play very well if she practiced more. She has very good style, though her taste is not equal to Anne's. Anne would have been a delightful player if her health had allowed her to learn." Elizabeth looked at Darcy, but from the whole of his behavior to Miss de Bourgh, she felt that he had no romantic feelings toward her at all. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning, writing to Jane, when she heard a ring at the door. To her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room. He seemed astonished, too, on finding her alone, and apologized by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies were at home. They then sat down and seemed in danger of sinking into total silence. It was absolutely necessary to think of something, and so she said, "How very suddenly you all left Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?" "Perfectly so, I thank you." After a short pause, she added, "Does Mr. Bingley have any plans to return to Netherfield again?" "I do not know, but it does not seem likely that he will spend much time there in the future." Elizabeth made no answer. He soon began with, "This seems a very comfortable house. It must be very nice for Mrs. Collins to be settled so close to her own family and friends." "Close? It is nearly 50 miles. But it is a good road. Yes, I call it very close." Just then, Charlotte and her sister returned from their walk. After sitting a few minutes longer, Mr. Darcy went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, he must be in love with you." But when Elizabeth told them of his silence, it did not seem very likely. They decided that he must have wanted some fresh air. In fact, both young men must have felt a similar need for fresh air, for they visited Mr. Collins's house almost every day. It was plain to them all that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he enjoyed Elizabeth's company. But why Mr. Darcy came was more difficult to understand. He frequently sat there for 10 minutes without opening his lips, and when he did speak, it seemed to be out of necessity rather than of choice. Mrs. Collins had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility that he liked her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea, and so she did not think it right to press the subject, for fear of raising expectations which might only end in disappointment. Chapter 9. Darcy Bewitched. More than once did Elizabeth, on walks within the park, unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. She took care to tell him that this was where she liked to walk alone. How it could happen a second time, therefore, was very strange. Yet it did, and even a third. She was walking one day when, instead of being again surprised by Mr. Darcy, she saw Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Do you leave Kent on Saturday?" she said. "Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again." "He does just as he pleases." "Yes, I do not know anybody who does what he likes more than Mr. Darcy. Is his sister the same?" "Miss Darcy is a lovely girl," said Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Of course she is. But does she give you much trouble?" He looked at her very seriously, and she was convinced that she had got pretty near the truth. "She is a favorite of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think you may know them." "A little. Their brother is a great friend of Darcy's." "Yes," said Elizabeth. "Mr. Darcy takes good care of Mr. Bingley?" "Yes. From something he told me, I think Bingley has much to thank him for." "What is it you mean?" "Well, he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from entering a bad marriage, but without mentioning names. I only suspected it to be Bingley." "Did Mr. Darcy give you reasons for his actions?" "I understood that there were some very strong objections against the lady." Elizabeth was certain that Colonel Fitzwilliam was speaking about Bingley and Jane. She had always thought it was the actions of Miss Bingley that had separated them, but it had actually been Darcy who had ruined her sister's happiness. Thinking about this made her cry and gave her a headache, so she decided not to go to Rosings that evening, where they were to drink tea. When the others had gone, Elizabeth decided to reread all the letters which Jane had written to her. They contained no actual complaint, but it was clear that she was not happy. She now knew that this was the fault of Mr. Darcy. Suddenly, she heard the sound of the doorbell. To her amazement, she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. He immediately asked her about her headache. She answered him coldly. After a silence of several minutes, he came toward her and began, "I have tried, but I cannot help it. My feelings will not go away. You must allow me to tell you how very much I admire and love you." Elizabeth was too surprised to speak. Her silence told him that she felt the same way, and so he continued. His feelings were in clear competition with his pride. Even though she disliked him, she could not ignore the compliment of his affection. She meant to be polite in her refusal, until his talk of money and family caused her to lose all sympathy. He told her that he had tried to overcome his feelings, but could not, and now he hoped he would be rewarded with her agreeing to marry him. As he said this, she could see that he thought she would say yes. When he stopped speaking, she said, "If I could feel the need to be polite, I would be. But I do not. I have never wanted your love, and it has been given to me without my asking for it." Mr. Darcy looked very surprised. His face became pale with anger, and after a long pause he said, "And this is your reply? Why am I rejected so rudely? You know that I have strong reasons for my answer. How could I accept the man who has ruined the happiness of my sister? I have every reason in the world to hate you. You cannot deny that you acted to divide them from each other." He calmly replied, "I do not deny that I did everything I could to separate my friend from your sister, nor that I was happy with my success." Elizabeth turned red. "But it is not only this situation," she continued, "that has caused me to dislike you. Mr. Wickham, too, has suffered much at your hand." "Suffered?" repeated Darcy. "Ha! So this is your opinion of me? I think you are just upset at my feelings toward your family. Well, could you really expect me to congratulate myself at becoming part of a family so beneath my own? Mr. Darcy, you could not have proposed marriage to me in any possible way that would have made me think of accepting it. Again he looked surprised. She went on, From the first moment I met you, I saw your arrogance and your sense of self-importance. I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever marry. You have said quite enough. I perfectly understand your feelings. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time. And with these words, he quickly left. Elizabeth woke up the next morning to a head full of thoughts. She could not believe that Mr. Darcy was in love with her, so much so that he had wanted to marry her. She decided to take a long walk. As she was walking, she met Mr. Darcy. He simply handed her a letter, said, "Will you please read this?" and walked away. With the strongest curiosity, Elizabeth opened the letter and read, "Firstly, do not worry. This letter does not repeat the offer I made to you last night. Last night you accused me of two very different things. The first was that I had acted to separate Mr. Bingley from your sister, and the other that I had ruined the life of Mr. Wickham. Please find in this letter an explanation of my actions. I am sorry if they upset you. When I arrived in Hertfordshire, I soon noticed Bingley's feelings toward your sister. They were stronger than anything I had seen in him before. But in your sister I did not notice any change, and so I believed that she did not feel the same way. If I was mistaken, I am sorry. I objected to their marriage strongly, mostly due to the behavior of your family, and especially that of your three younger sisters. I am sorry to offend you, but you should know that the behavior of yourself and your oldest sister is often praised. Miss Bingley and I followed Bingley to London. We told him to change his mind, for your sister did not have feelings for him. I then convinced him not to return to Hertfordshire. It was difficult at first, but finally I succeeded. I even went as far as to hide from him your sister's being in town. Her brother still does not know it. I now turn to the matter of Mr. Wickham. I am not sure of what he has told you of me, but I will tell you everything I can. Mr. Wickham is the son of a very respectable man. After his father died, my father paid for his education. My father liked him very much. When my excellent father died about 5 years ago, he left £1,000 to Mr. Wickham, with the wish that he would enter the church. However, Mr. Wickham wrote to me soon after to tell me that he wanted to study law, and he needed more money. I sent him £3,000. In town, he spent my father's money, as quickly as he could. For about 3 years I heard little of him. When he again became low on money, I heard from him. This time I did not send him more, and he became very angry. I did not hear from him again until last summer. I must now tell you something which I wish to forget myself. About a year ago, my sister, who is more than 10 years younger than me, lived in town. Mr. Wickham found her there. Being only 15, she believed herself to be in love with him, and they planned to marry. She told me of this just in time, and I went to town a day or two before they planned to run away together. Certainly Mr. Wickham wanted my sister's money, but I cannot help thinking that he also wanted to get revenge on me. His revenge would have been complete indeed. This, Elizabeth, is the whole story. I will only add, God bless you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Elizabeth hardly knew what to feel. His actions toward her sister made her too angry for words. He did not show any regret for what he had done. His style was all pride. But what of Mr. Wickham? She had never heard of Mr. Wickham before he had come to Hertfordshire, and so knew nothing of his life, and of his plan to marry Miss Darcy. Lizzie thought of Colonel Fitzwilliam's face when she had asked about Miss Darcy only the morning before. She remembered a conversation between Wickham and herself. He had said he was not afraid of meeting Mr. Darcy. Yet he had not come to the Netherfield ball. He had told everyone about his history only after Mr. Darcy had returned to London, even though he had told her earlier that he could not talk about it, out of respect for Darcy's father. How differently he now looked to her. Mr. Darcy, as proud as he was not a liar. Lizzie grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling she had been blind and prejudiced. Chapter 10. Wickham Exposed. Mr. Darcy and Mr. Fitzwilliam were able to present themselves in a very light and friendly manner during the rest of their stay. After thanking Lady Catherine and her daughter for their kind hospitality, Mr. Darcy and Mr. Fitzwilliam left Rosings the next morning. Lizzie now had only one more week left at Hunsford. She soon knew Mr. Darcy's letter by heart. She studied every sentence, and her feelings toward its writer were at times very different. When she remembered how he had spoken to her, she still felt angry. However, when she thought of how quick she had been to judge him, her anger was turned against herself, and she felt bad for having disappointed him. She felt pleased that he had asked for her hand, but she did not for a second wish that she had replied differently, or even that she would ever see him again. She had behaved very badly toward him, and her family was a source of embarrassment for both her and Jane, and she knew that they would never change. She now also knew that Mr. Bingley had felt very strongly toward Jane, and that it had been her own family's behavior that had ruined everything for her. When to these thoughts she added her new opinion of Wickham's character, she could hardly find a happy thing to think of at all, and it was all she could do to make conversation at the table during her last week with Charlotte. The very last evening was spent at Rosings, and Lady Catherine gave them so many instructions on their journey, and so strongly recommended that they pack their dresses in the right way, that after poor Maria returned, she pulled all of her dresses out to repack them. When they parted, Lady Catherine wished them a good journey, and invited them to come to Hunsford again next year. And Miss de Bourgh went as far as to hold out her hand to both. On Saturday morning, Elizabeth and Mr. Collins arrived at breakfast a few minutes before the others appeared, and he took the opportunity of wishing her a safe trip. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, "I am sure our life here must seem very dull to a young lady like yourself, but we thank you greatly for coming. We have certainly done our best, and we have been able to introduce you to Lady Catherine. I hope you will be able to carry a good report of us into Hertfordshire, my dear cousin. I also hope, dear Elizabeth, that you will be lucky in marriage. My dear Charlotte and I are so similar and so very happy. We seem to have been designed for each other." Elizabeth was happy for the couple, but this happiness was interrupted with the thoughts of Charlotte's mother-in-law. Poor Charlotte! It was very difficult for Elizabeth to leave her friend with such a person. But she had chosen the marriage with her eyes open, and did not seem wholly unhappy with her choice. At long last, Maria and Elizabeth left Hunsford. Their journey was performed without much conversation, and within 4 hours they reached Mr. Gardiner's house in London, where they were to stay a few days. Jane looked well, but their aunt kept them so busy that they hardly had a chance to talk, and Elizabeth knew she would have to wait until they arrived at Longbourn to tell her sister of Mr. Darcy's proposal. She could hardly wait to see her sister's reaction. It was the second week in May when the 3 young ladies arrived in Hertfordshire. There they would meet Mr. Bennet's carriage for the final journey to Longbourn. As they arrived in town, they noticed both Kitty and Lydia looking out of a window upstairs. The 2 girls had waited for them there over an hour, visiting a hat shop and looking out for officers. After welcoming their sisters, they took them to a table on which was a spread of meats. "Isn't this nice? Isn't this a good surprise?" "And we meant to pay for you all," added Lydia. "But you will have to pay now, as we have just spent our money shopping." Then, showing her purchases, she said, "Look here, I have bought this hat. I do not think it is very pretty, but I thought I might as well buy it. Besides, it doesn't matter what I wear this summer, as all the officers are moving to Brighton in a fortnight." "Are they indeed?" cried Elizabeth happily. "Yes, I do so want Papa to take us all there for the summer." "Yes," thought Elizabeth. "Just imagine it, my sisters running after a whole camp full of soldiers." "I've got some news for you," said Lydia as they sat down to lunch. Jane and Elizabeth looked at each other and then told the waiter to leave the room. Lydia laughed and said, As if he cared. But he is an ugly man. I am glad he is gone. Well, my news is about dear Wickham. There is no danger of Wickham's marrying Mary King. She has gone down to her uncle at Liverpool, gone to stay. Wickham is safe. And Mary King is safe, added Elizabeth. Oh, I don't think he cared about her. Who could, about such a thin, pale little thing? As soon as all ate, and the older ones paid, they all squeezed into the carriage. Well, cried Lydia, isn't this fun? Now, let us hear what has happened to you all since you went away. Have you seen any nice men? Have you been flirting with anyone? I had hoped that one of you would have got a husband before you came back. Lydia talked the whole way home to Longbourn. Elizabeth listened as little as she could, but there was no escaping the frequent mention of Wickham's name. They arrived home to a warm welcome. Mrs. Bennet was happy to see that Jane was as beautiful as ever. The Lucas family were there to meet Maria, and more than once during dinner did Mr. Bennet say to Elizabeth, I am glad you are back, Lizzie. Elizabeth could not wait much longer to talk to her sister alone. She decided, though, that she wouldn't say anything about Mr. Bingley, in case it hurt her sister even more. The next morning, she told her of all that had happened between herself and Mr. Darcy. Miss Bennet was surprised at first, but then her admiration for her sister quickly made Darcy's feelings seem quite natural. He should not have been so sure of succeeding, she said, but how disappointed he must be now. Indeed, replied Elizabeth, I do feel sorry for him, but I am sure he will forget me soon. Now, let me tell you all about Mr. Wickham. She then spoke of the letter, telling her everything she had heard about George Wickham. Poor Jane. She did not think one man could possibly be so bad. What a terrible discovery it was for her. She tried to clear Mr. Wickham, then Mr. Darcy, but she could not clear one without involving the other. This will not do, said Elizabeth. You never will be able to make both of them good. You must make a choice. For my part, I think it is Darcy who is good, but you can choose who you like. Poor Mr. Darcy, said Jane. Dear Lizzie, only think how he must be feeling, and having to tell you such things about his sister, too. It really is shocking. And poor Wickham, he looks like such a gentleman. Yes, that is true. One has got all the goodness, and the other looks as if he does. I always thought Mr. Darcy looked like a gentleman, unlike you. Yes, I thought I was very clever, disliking him without any reason, said Lizzie. How unfortunate it is that you spoke so warmly about Wickham to Mr. Darcy, given his past. That is true. But tell me, do you think I should tell people about the true Mr. Wickham? Miss Bennet paused a little, and then replied, No, I don't think you should. What is your opinion? I think I should keep it a secret. Mr. Darcy would not want me to speak publicly about his sister. And anyway, who would believe me? People in this area dislike Mr. Darcy so much that it would be too difficult to convince them. Elizabeth felt much better having shared these two secrets with her sister. But she still had not told her the other half of Mr. Darcy's letter, or explained to her sister how much Bingley had really loved her. She simply hoped that he might come back to Hertfordshire and tell her himself. Well, Lizzie, said Mrs. Bennet one day, what do you think of this sad business of Jane's? It seems that she did not see anything of Mr. Bingley in London. Well, it seems she will never get him now. There is no talk of him coming to Netherfield again in the summer. I do not believe he will ever live at Netherfield again. Oh, well, I am sure Jane will die of a broken heart, and then he will be sorry for what he has done. Chapter 11. A False Friend. The first week of their return was soon gone. The second began. It was the last of the soldiers' stay in Meryton, and the misery of Kitty and Lydia was extreme. Lydia's sadness did not last long, for she soon received an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the young wife of a colonel, to accompany her to Brighton. Lydia's excitement, the delight of Mrs. Bennet, and the envy of Kitty, cannot be described. In Lydia's imagination, a visit to Brighton held every possibility of happiness. She saw herself sitting under an army tent, happily flirting with at least 6 officers at once. On the very last day of the officers being at Meryton, Mr. Wickham dined with other officers at Longbourn. Elizabeth did not behave warmly to him. When he asked about her time at Hunsford, she mentioned that Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy had spent 3 weeks at Rosings. He looked surprised and displeased. After a moment he asked, "How long did you say Mr. Darcy was at Rosings?" "Nearly 3 weeks." "And you saw him frequently?" "Yes, almost every day. After spending time with him, I do not think he is so bad after all." "Indeed?" cried Mr. Wickham. For a few minutes he was silent. Then he turned to her again and said in the gentlest of voices, "I am happy to hear that he behaved well toward you. Elizabeth, you understand how terribly he has treated me, and so you will understand that any improvement in him is a good thing for all of us." Elizabeth did not encourage him to talk about his past again, and for the rest of the evening Wickham did not pay any more attention to Elizabeth. Both parted with the hope of never meeting again. Lydia left the next day for Brighton, and life at Longbourn became very quiet indeed. Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's aunt, had kindly invited her to travel north with her and her husband to the lakes. The trip was only a fortnight off when a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner to delay it. Mr. Gardiner had important business. As a result, they would leave in July and could not go as far as the lakes. Instead, they would travel north to Derbyshire. Mrs. Gardiner had spent some time there before she married, and so was interested in returning. For Elizabeth, however, it was impossible for her to think of Derbyshire without thinking of Mr. Darcy's house, Pemberley. 4 weeks passed, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, arrived at Longbourn. The children were left in Jane's care. The Gardiners and Elizabeth set off early the next morning. Lizzie soon learned that Lambton, where Mrs. Gardiner had once lived, was less than 5 miles from Pemberley. Mrs. Gardiner said that she would very much like to visit it again. Elizabeth quickly told them that she was tired of seeing great houses, but Mrs. Gardiner stopped her. "It is much more than a fine house," she said. "They have some of the finest forest in the country." To Pemberley, then, they were to go. Elizabeth said no more. What if she met Mr. Darcy there? It would be awful. She blushed at the very idea. Elizabeth felt very nervous as they approached Pemberley the next day. The park was very large and contained many different trees. Pemberley House was a large stone building. Behind it were high hills, and in front a stream. Elizabeth was delighted. It was naturally very beautiful. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, showed them around the house. From a window, Elizabeth noticed beautiful views across the hills, the river, and trees as far as she could see. The rooms were large and had beautiful furniture, even more elegant than that at Rosings. "And to think," she thought, "I could have lived in this house." "We are expecting Mr. Darcy tomorrow," said Mrs. Reynolds, "with a large party of friends." Elizabeth was very happy that they had not been a day later. Her aunt called her to look at a picture. It was of Mr. Wickham. "That young man used to live here," said Mrs. Reynolds, "but he is now in the army, and I am afraid he has turned out very wild. And that," she continued with a smile, pointing to another picture, "is my master. Lizzie, does it look like him?" said Mrs. Gardiner. "Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" asked Mrs. Reynolds. Elizabeth turned red and said, "A little." "And do you think he is a very handsome gentleman?" "Yes, very handsome. He is very kind, too. Anyone who has met him will tell you. I have never known him to be angry in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old. And he is very generous to the poor." Elizabeth was very surprised to hear this. "If I were to go through the world, I could not meet with a better man," Mrs. Reynolds said. "Can this be Mr. Darcy?" thought Elizabeth. They soon returned downstairs, and, saying goodbye to Mrs. Reynolds, left the house. As they were walking, the owner of the house suddenly appeared from behind the stables. Mr. Darcy seemed so surprised that he could not move, but he soon recovered and came toward Elizabeth with a smile. She was so embarrassed she could hardly answer his questions. She was amazed at how different his manner was. Yet every sentence he spoke increased her embarrassment at having been found at his house. Soon after, he left them to their walk. Elizabeth felt that her coming there was the most unfortunate thing in the world. Oh, why did she come? Or, why did he come a day before he was expected? She blushed again and again. They began a beautiful walk by the side of the river, but Elizabeth's thoughts were fixed on Mr. Darcy. While wandering on in a slow manner, however, they were again surprised by the sight of Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth, although again surprised, was at least more prepared than before. Mr. Darcy asked her if she would introduce him to her friends. Elizabeth could hardly hide a smile at his now wanting to be introduced to some of her relatives, the very people against whom his pride had struggled. The conversation soon turned to fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite Mr. Gardner to fish in the river at Pemberley as often as he liked. Elizabeth said nothing, but it made her very happy. Why is he so different? She asked herself. After what I said at Hunsford, it is impossible that he should still love me. Mr. Gardner paused to give Mrs. Gardner his arm, and Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth walked on ahead together. After a short silence, Elizabeth told him that she had thought he would not be at the house that day. I understand, he said. I arrived a day early. The rest of my party will join me early tomorrow. Among them are some you will know, Mr. Bingley and his sisters. Also, Elizabeth, will you allow me to introduce my sister to you during your stay at Lambton? Elizabeth was very surprised, but agreed immediately. They had walked quickly and now stood on the grass, waiting for her aunt and uncle. The silence between them was very awkward. Finally, her relatives arrived, and he said goodbye. The observations of her uncle and aunt now began. Each of them told her that he was much better than anything they had expected. From what we have seen of him, continued Mr. Gardner, I cannot believe he treated poor Mr. Wickham as badly as everybody says he did. The very next morning, Mr. Darcy and his sister came to visit. Her uncle and aunt suddenly wondered if the young man was interested in their niece. They felt that there was no other way of explaining the sudden attention. Miss Darcy was tall, and though little more than 16, she was womanly and graceful, yet very shy. Soon after, Mr. Bingley also arrived, entering the room with a smile. On seeing Bingley, Elizabeth's thoughts flew to her sister. At one point, he leaned over to her and said that it was a long time since they had seen Jane. Then he added, "It is more than 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November." Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact. When the visitors stood to leave, Mr. Darcy asked Mr. and Mrs. Gardner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley. That evening, Elizabeth lay awake 2 whole hours. She certainly did not hate him. She felt respect for him, and now feelings of friendship. She was also grateful to him, not only because he had once loved her, but because he still loved her enough to forgive her for thinking so badly of him. The aunt and niece decided that, as Miss Darcy had come to see them on the very day of her arrival, they should go and see her at Pemberley as soon as possible. They decided to go the following morning. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she could not explain why. Mr. Gardner left them soon after breakfast. He was to go fishing with the gentlemen at Pemberley, and left to meet with them before noon. Chapter 12. Scandal. Convinced that Miss Bingley was jealous of the attention given her by Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth could not help thinking that she would be very unwelcome at Pemberley. On arriving the next day, they were met by Miss Darcy, Mrs. Hurst, and Miss Bingley, and the lady with whom Miss Darcy lived in London, Mrs. Annesley. Elizabeth saw that Miss Bingley was watching her closely, and that she could not speak a word, especially to Miss Darcy, without drawing her attention. Soon after, Mr. Darcy appeared, and Elizabeth noticed that every eye in the room watched his behavior toward her closely. Miss Bingley, becoming angry, said, "Miss Eliza, I heard that the soldiers have now left Meryton. That must be a great loss to your family." Elizabeth replied calmly to this attack on her and her sisters. Mr. Darcy's face did not change. He seemed only to become more and more interested in Miss Bennet. Their visit did not continue much longer, and as Mr. Darcy walked the ladies to their carriage, Miss Bingley began criticizing Elizabeth's poor character, behavior, and dress. But Georgiana would not join her. Her brother had spoken so warmly of Elizabeth that she could not help but like her. When Darcy returned, Miss Bingley continued, "How terrible Miss Eliza Bennet looks this morning. Mr. Darcy," she cried, "I never could see any beauty in her." Darcy paused and then replied, "I have now, for many months, considered her to be one of the most beautiful women I know." Miss Bingley realized that she had forced him to say what would hurt no one but herself. On the third morning, Elizabeth received 2 letters from Jane at once. She opened the first. The first half gave her normal news from home. The second half, however, seemed to have been written in a hurry. It read, "Since writing the above, dearest Lizzie, something very serious and unexpected has happened. It is about poor Lydia. A letter came late last night from Colonel Forster to tell us that she has gone off to Scotland with one of his officers. With Wickham! Imagine our surprise. But I am willing to hope the best. I must finish here. I hope you will be able to understand my handwriting." Without pausing, Elizabeth tore open the second letter. It had been written a day after the first. "Dear Lizzie, I have bad news for you, and it cannot wait. As bad as a marriage between Mr. Wickham and our poor Lydia would be, we now do not know if it has happened at all. Lydia had told Mr. Forster that they were going to Scotland, but Denny told the Colonel that Wickham never planned to go there or to marry Lydia at all. The Colonel searched the whole road from London and finally came to Longbourn to tell our parents the bad news. Dear Lizzie, will you come home soon? My father is going to London with Colonel Forster to try to find her. If only you could return with our uncle, it would be a great help to all of us." "Oh, where is my uncle?" cried Elizabeth, running to the door. As she opened it, Mr. Darcy appeared. Before he could say a word, she said, "I must find Mr. Gardiner this minute." "Good God! What is the matter?" he cried. "Let a servant find him. You sit down." She did as he said, and a servant ran off. Elizabeth sat down, and Mr. Darcy stood nearby. "Can I get you a glass of wine?" "No, I thank you," she replied, beginning to cry. "I am fine, but I have just had some very bad news from Longbourn. I have just had a letter from Jane. My younger sister has thrown herself into the arms of Mr. Wickham. They have left Brighton together. You know him too well. Do not need to continue." "This is terrible indeed," cried Darcy. "But is it certain?" "Oh, yes. They left Brighton together on Sunday night, and went as far as London, but not beyond. They are certainly not in Scotland." "And what has been done to find her?" "My father has gone to London, and Jane has written to ask my uncle's help. We will have to be off, I hope, in half an hour." Darcy became silent for some minutes. Elizabeth thought that he must be deciding that he could never be connected with such a family. Never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when there was no chance of him loving her back. He soon spoke. "I will leave you now. I wish I could say something that would comfort you. I fear that we will not see you at Pemberley today then. No. Please apologize for us to Miss Darcy." He told her that he would, and with a parting look, left the room. Elizabeth could not wait to be at home, to see Jane and her family. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner had hurried back, and Elizabeth read them both of Jane's letters. Though Lydia had never been a favorite with them, they were very concerned. They made plans to leave within the hour. They reached Longbourn the next day. Elizabeth jumped out and ran to meet Jane. She asked if they had had any news. "Not yet," replied Jane. "But now that my dear uncle is here, I hope everything will be well." "Is my father in town?" "Yes, he went on Tuesday." They all went upstairs and found Mrs. Bennet. "If only," she said, "we had all gone to Brighton. My poor dear Lydia had nobody to take care of her. And now Mr. Bennet has gone away, and I know he will fight Wickham, and then he will be killed. The Collinses will turn us out of this house, And where will we go?" Mr. Gardner told her that he would go to London the next day to help find her. "Oh, my dear brother," replied Mrs. Bennet, "when you find them, if they are not married already, make them marry. And above all, keep Mr. Bennet from fighting." In the afternoon, the two older Miss Bennets were able to have half an hour by themselves. "Tell me, Jane, did our family know of the match?" said Lizzie. "My father and mother knew nothing of it, but Kitty had known for many weeks that they were in love with each other." "But not before they went to Brighton?" "No, I believe not." "And did Colonel Forster tell you what was written in Lydia's note to his wife?" "Yes, he brought it with him." Jane took it out and gave it to Elizabeth. It read, "My dear Harriet, you will laugh when you read this. I am going to Scotland with the man I love. I haven't told anyone at Longbourn. It will be a big surprise when I write to them and sign my name Lydia Wickham. What a good joke it will be. Goodbye. Give my love to Colonel Forster. Your friend, Lydia Bennet." "Oh, thoughtless, thoughtless Lydia," cried Elizabeth. Mr. Gardner left Longbourn on Sunday. On Tuesday, his wife received a letter from him. It told them that he was now with his brother and that they were looking in every hotel in town. Every day at Longbourn was full of anxiety, especially when the letters arrived. But before they heard again from Mr. Gardner, a letter arrived from Mr. Collins. It read, "My dear Sir, we were sorry to hear the news of your daughter in a letter from Lady Lucas yesterday. Indeed, the death of your daughter would have been better than this. Lady Catherine and her daughter were also shocked. They agreed with me that a wrong step from one daughter can greatly affect all other daughters. For who, as Lady Catherine herself said, will connect themselves with such a family? Regards." Mr. Gardner soon wrote with bad news. It seemed Wickham had left very large gambling debts behind him, and more than £1,000 would be needed to clear his expenses in Brighton. He added that they might expect to see their father at home on the following day, which was Saturday. "What, is he coming home without poor Lydia?" cried Mrs. Bennet. "Who is to fight Wickham and make him marry her?" When Mr. Bennet arrived, he said as little as ever. It was not till the afternoon, when he had joined them at tea, that Elizabeth introduced the subject. "Father, do you think they are in London?" "Yes. Where else can they be so well hidden?" "And Lydia used to want to go to London," added Kitty. "She is happy then," said her father, "and she will probably stay there for some time." Then, after a short silence, he turned to Kitty and continued to speak. "And I suppose you will run away soon too?" "No, Papa," said Kitty. "If I ever go to Brighton, I will behave better than Lydia." "You go to Brighton?" "No, Kitty. I have at last learned to be careful. You will not go to any balls, and you will not leave the house until you have spent 10 minutes of every day doing something useful." Kitty began to cry. "Well, well," he said, "do not make yourself unhappy. If you are a good girl for the next 10 years, I will take you to a party at the end of them." Chapter 13. Darcy averts the scandal. 2 days after Mr. Bennet's return, a letter arrived for him from their uncle. Jane and Elizabeth had been enjoying a walk behind the house, when they saw the housekeeper walking past them with the letter. The girls eagerly ran to the house in order to discover its contents. As soon as Mr. Bennet had finished reading the letter, Elizabeth asked if she might also read it. Mr. Bennet agreed, and asked Elizabeth to read it aloud. "My dear brother, at last I am able to send you some news of my niece. Soon after you left me on Saturday, I found out in what part of London they were. I have seen them both." "Then they are married," cried Jane. Elizabeth read on. "I have seen them both. They are not married, but if you will agree to the following, they soon will be. All that is required of you is that you agree to give your daughter, after your death, her equal share of your money. Also, while you are alive, you must give her £100 per year. Please send me your answer as soon as possible. We think it best if your daughter stays with us until then. Yours, Edward Gardner." "Is it possible that he will marry her?" cried Elizabeth. Wickham is not so bad, then, said her sister. Well, they must marry, said her father. There is nothing else to be done. But there are two things that I want to know. One is, how much money your uncle has given him to marry her, and the other, how can I ever pay him back? Money? Cried Jane. What do you mean? I mean that no man would marry Lydia for so little money. That is very true, said Elizabeth, and he also has many debts to pay as well. It must be my uncle's doing. What a generous, good man. Elizabeth took the letter, and she and Jane went upstairs to tell their mother. Mary and Kitty were both with Mrs. Bennet. After telling her that there was good news, the letter was read aloud. My dear, dear Lydia, cried Mrs. Bennet, she will be married. My good, kind brother. How I long to see her and dear Wickham too. Mamma, said Jane, our uncle has probably given Wickham a large amount of money to convince him to marry her. Well, cried her mother, so he should. It is the first time we have ever had anything from him, except a few presents. I am so happy. In a short time I shall have a daughter married, Mrs. Wickham, and she was only 16 last June. Elizabeth was now feeling very sorry that she had told Mr. Darcy about her sister's situation, for as her marriage would very soon happen, they could hope to hide the last week's events from all those who were not there. She wanted to hear from him just when there seemed no chance that she would. She was convinced that she could have been happy with him when it was no longer likely they would meet. Elizabeth now felt that they would have been a very good match. By her friendly ways, he might have been softened, and from his knowledge of the world, she would have learned a great deal. But such a marriage could not take place now. Mr. Gardiner soon wrote again to his brother. He mentioned that Wickham planned to move to the north of England after the wedding. Mr. Bennet and his daughters saw the advantages of the move as clearly as Mr. Gardiner. But Mrs. Bennet was not at all pleased. She had hoped that Lydia would live nearby. Their sister's wedding day arrived. The couple were to travel to Longbourn as soon as they were married. They arrived that afternoon. Lydia was still Lydia, unashamed, wild, noisy, and fearless. She turned from sister to sister, demanding their congratulations. Wickham did not seem at all embarrassed. His manners were as charming as always, and it was Elizabeth and Jane who was embarrassed for Lydia and Wickham. It has been 3 months, cried Lydia, since I went away, and I did not think I would be married when I came back again. What fun it is that I am! The family looked at her in disbelief. Later at dinner, Elizabeth heard Lydia say to Jane, Ah, Jane, I take your place at the table now, and you must go lower because I'm a married woman. Their visitors were only to stay for 10 days with them, and no one but Mrs. Bennet wished that their stay would be longer. It was clear to Elizabeth that Wickham's feelings toward Lydia were not equal to Lydia's for him. Lydia loved him dearly. He was her dear Wickham, and no one else could compete. One morning, soon after their arrival, as she was sitting with her 2 older sisters, she said to Elizabeth, Lizzie, I never told you about my wedding. Do you want to hear it? Not really, replied Elizabeth. You are so strange. But I must tell you. We were married, you know, at St. Clement's Church. Well, Monday morning came, and I was so afraid that something would happen to stop the wedding. We had breakfast, and then Uncle was called away on business. I was so frightened because he might take too long, and then who would give me away? But then I remembered that Mr. Darcy could have— Mr. Darcy? Repeated Elizabeth in amazement. Oh, yes. He was to come there with Wickham. But, oh no, I promised I wouldn't say anything. It was to be a secret. Then do not say another word about it, said Jane. Oh, yes, said Elizabeth, burning with curiosity. We will ask you no questions. Thank you, said Lydia, for if you did, I would tell you everything, and then Wickham would be angry. What could be Mr. Darcy's connection with all of this? Lizzie, running to her room, took out a sheet of paper and wrote a short letter to her aunt to request an explanation of what Lydia had said. She had the satisfaction of receiving an answer to her letter as soon as she possibly could. She ran to find a quiet place to open it. My dear niece, I have just received your letter, and I must say that I am surprised. Don't think me angry. I just thought that you would have known all of this already. But let me explain. On the very day of my coming home from Longbourn, your uncle had a most unexpected visitor. Mr. Darcy called to tell Mr. Gardner that he had found your sister and Mr. Wickham. It seems he left Derbyshire only one day after ourselves and came to town to find them. He told us that because of his own actions, Wickham's poor character was not widely known, allowing Lydia to be tricked by him. He generously blamed the whole situation on his own pride, and therefore saw it as his duty to find them. There is a lady, it seems, a Mrs. Young, who some time ago cared for Miss Darcy. After 2 or 3 days, she finally told Darcy where they were. I would say he gave her quite a lot of money. He went to them. He saw Wickham and afterward Lydia. He tried to persuade her to return to her friends, but she refused to leave. Wickham confessed that he left because of his debts, and that Lydia had only been a convenient companion. Mr. Darcy asked him why he had not married your sister at once. But he found, in reply to this question, that Wickham still hoped that he would marry a girl with money. They met several times. Wickham, of course, wanted more than he could get, but at length it was all decided. Mr. Darcy's next step was to tell your uncle. He told us that he would pay for everything. Your uncle, of course, argued with him, but Mr. Darcy insisted that he would take care of everything. At last your uncle agreed, and instead of helping his niece, was forced instead to take the credit for it. Your letter gave him great pleasure because it allowed me to tell you the truth. But Lizzie, no one must hear of this but Jane. I believe I have now told you everything. You must know, Lizzie, your uncle would not have agreed if we did not believe Mr. Darcy had another interest in all of this. Will you be very angry with me, my dear Lizzie, if I take this opportunity of saying how much I like him? Perhaps we can all go to Pemberley again sometime soon. I must go. The children are calling me. Yours sincerely, M. Gardner. This letter made Elizabeth's heart beat faster. He had followed them to town and found them. He then had met, reasoned with, persuaded, and finally paid the man whom he always wished to avoid. He had done all this for a girl whom he did not like or respect. But her heart whispered that he had done it for her. They owed everything to him. Oh, she was sorry for every bad word she had ever said to him. And she was also so very, very proud of him. Chapter 14. Matchmaking Plot. The day of Wickham and Lydia's departure soon came. "Oh, my dear Lydia," cried Mrs. Bennet, "when will we meet again?" "I don't know. Not for 2 or 3 years, perhaps." "Write to me very often, my dear." "As often as I can. But you know married women have never much time for writing." The loss of her daughter made Mrs. Bennet very sad for several days. Soon, however, she received some very interesting information. The housekeeper at Netherfield was preparing for the arrival of Mr. Bingley. "Well, well, and so Mr. Bingley is coming down," she said. "He is nothing to us, you know, but still, he is very welcome to come to Netherfield if he likes, and who knows what may happen?" Miss Bennet turned red when she heard the news. It was many months since she had mentioned his name to Elizabeth. But now, with this news, a small light of hope began to shine. Mr. Bingley arrived. Mrs. Bennet counted the days before she could send him an invitation to dinner. But on the 3rd morning after his arrival in Hertfordshire, she saw him from her window enter the park and ride toward the house. She quickly called her daughters to the window. Jane kept her place at the table, but Elizabeth went to the window. She looked, saw Mr. Darcy with him, and sat down with her sister. "There is a gentleman with him, Mamma," said Kitty. "Who can it be?" "I do not know. It looks just like that man that used to be with him before. Mr. What's his name? That tall, proud man." "Oh, it's Mr. Darcy. Well, I must say that I hate the very sight of him." Jane looked at Elizabeth. She knew that the last time they met had been in Derbyshire, and that her sister would be nervous to see him. She did not, however, know the contents of Mrs. Gardner's letter, or her sister's changed feelings toward him. To Jane, He was only a man whose proposals Lizzie had refused. She sat at her work, trying her best to concentrate. The two men entered the room, and Elizabeth said very little to either. She only looked at Darcy once. He looked serious, as usual, and she thought more as he had looked in Hertfordshire than as she had seen him at Pemberley. Darcy, after asking after Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, barely said anything. She was disappointed and angry with herself for being so. What did I expect? She thought. Yet, why did he come? It's been a long time, Mr. Bingley, since you went away, said Mrs. Bennet. He agreed with her. Many changes have happened in the neighborhood since you went away. Miss Lucas is married, and one of my own daughters. You must have seen it in the papers. It was in the Times and the Courier. Did you see it? Bingley replied that he did and made his congratulations. Elizabeth dared not look at Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth's embarrassment increased at her mother's open attentions to one guest at the expense of the other. Her mother's rudeness to Mr. Darcy made her wish that the whole family could know what he had done for them. She was pleased to see, however, how clearly Bingley still admired her sister. As soon as they were gone, Elizabeth went for a walk to think. Mr. Darcy's behavior astonished and worried her. Why, if he came only to be silent, serious, and indifferent, she said, did he come at all? Teasing man. I will think no more about him. Mrs. Bennet, however, was very happy. She had seen enough of Bingley's behavior to Jane to be convinced that she would get him at last. From this time on, Mrs. Bennet did everything she could to get her oldest daughter and Bingley alone. The next day, he came to tea. Mr. Bennet was in the library, and Mary was upstairs playing piano. Mrs. Bennet sat looking and winking at Elizabeth and Catherine for a long time, without success. Kitty finally asked, What is the matter, Mamma? What do you keep winking at me for? Nothing, child, nothing. I did not wink at you, said her impatient mother. Suddenly she got up and saying to Kitty, Come here, my love, I want to speak to you, took her out of the room. In a few minutes, Mrs. Bennet half opened the door and called out, Lizzie, my dear, I want to speak with you. Elizabeth was forced to go. Bingley stayed for supper and arranged to go shooting with Mr. Bennet the next morning. He returned with Mr. Bennet for lunch, and Mrs. Bennet tried again. Lizzie returned after writing a letter to find that her mother had been successful. Jane and Bingley were alone together in deep conversation. Both faces changed color as she entered. Bingley left the room soon after, and Jane immediately told her sister that Bingley had proposed. That evening was one of great happiness for them all. Mrs. Bennet could not speak warmly enough of Bingley, and even Mr. Bennet looked very happy. Jane, I congratulate you, he said. You will be a very happy woman. Bingley, from this time, was a daily visitor at Longbourn. Elizabeth now had little time for conversation with her sister, for while Bingley was there, Jane had no time for anyone but him. I am the luckiest girl that ever lived, cried Jane one evening. Oh, Lizzie, I wish I could see you as happy. Oh, sister, perhaps if I am very lucky, I may meet with another Mr. Collins one day, she jokingly said. One morning, about a week after Bingley's engagement to Jane, a carriage and 4 horses drove up to the house. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She entered the room and gave a look down her nose to all within it. She said very stiffly to Elizabeth, I hope you are well, Miss Bennet. Elizabeth replied that she was. You have a very small park here, said Lady Catherine, after a short silence. Mrs. Bennet, very politely, asked if her ladyship would like something to drink, but Lady Catherine declined. Then, standing up, she said to Elizabeth, Miss Bennet, would you take a walk with me in the garden? Elizabeth agreed, and they soon left the house. Lady Catherine began, You understand, Miss Bennet, the reason for my visit. No, madam, I am afraid I do not. Miss Bennet, replied her ladyship in an angry voice, 2 days ago I was told that you, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, could soon become engaged to my own nephew, Mr. Darcy. Though it must be a terrible lie, I came here immediately to find out. If you believed it impossible to be true, said Elizabeth, very surprised, why would you come so far? I want you to tell me that it is not true. Well, is it? Your ladyship may ask questions that I do not choose to answer. No, Miss Bennet, you will tell me. Has my nephew asked you to marry him? Your ladyship has already said that would be impossible. Miss Bennet, do you know who I am? I have the right to know all about him. But you do not have the right to know about me, and your behavior does not encourage me to tell you. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now what have you to say? Only this. If he is, you can have no reason to think that he will make an offer to me. Lady Catherine paused, and then replied, It is a special kind of engagement. Since childhood it has been planned. It was the wish of his mother and of hers. And now, to think that it might be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth, of no importance in the world! I will not be kept from marrying Mr. Darcy, only because his mother and aunt wished him to marry Miss de Bourgh. He will make his own choice. Tell me, once and for all, are you engaged to him? I am not. Lady Catherine seemed pleased. And will you promise me never to enter into such an engagement? I will make no promise of the kind. Would my refusing him cause him to ask for his cousin's hand? I have nothing more to say on the subject. Not so fast. I have another objection. I know everything about your youngest sister's behavior and recent marriage. And is such a girl to be my nephew's sister? Is her husband to be his brother? Heaven and earth, what are you thinking? How can you think of polluting Pemberley this way? You have insulted me in every possible way, Lizzie said. I must now return to the house. Unfeeling, selfish girl! A connection with you will disgrace him in the eyes of everybody. She talked on until he reached the door of her carriage. I do not wish you well, Miss Bennet. I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention. I am most seriously displeased. Elizabeth made no answer, and walked into the house. Chapter 15. Happy Endings. The visit from Lady Catherine had upset Elizabeth very much. Lady Catherine, it appeared, had taken the trouble of this journey from Rosings just to break off her supposed engagement with Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth was sure that she would go to talk with her nephew also. If he had been undecided before, such a speech from his aunt might convince him. In that case, he would return no more. Happily, Mr. Bingley brought Darcy with him to Longbourn a few days after Lady Catherine's visit. Bingley, who wanted to be alone with Jane, proposed a walk. Bingley and Jane soon fell behind, leaving Elizabeth, Kitty, and Darcy to entertain each other. Kitty wished to call upon Maria Lucas. This left Elizabeth to go on alone with Darcy. She immediately said, Mr. Darcy, I must thank you for your extraordinary kindness to my poor sister. Ever since I have known it, I have wanted to tell you how grateful I am to you. I am very happy that you heard the truth, replied Darcy. I did not think Mrs. Gardiner could not be trusted. No, it was Lydia who told me first that you were involved, and of course I could not rest until I knew the rest. Let me thank you again, and again, in the name of all my family. If you will thank me, he replied, let it be for yourself alone. I believe I thought only of you. Elizabeth was too embarrassed to say a word. After a short pause, he added, If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affection and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever. Elizabeth immediately told him that her feelings toward him had changed completely. Her reply made him happier than he had ever been before. They walked on without knowing where they were going. She soon learned that his aunt did call on him, and had told him of her journey to Longbourn, its purpose, and the conversation that had taken place between herself and Elizabeth. But, unluckily for her ladyship, the effect of her visit had been opposite of what she had wanted. It taught me to hope, he said, as I had not allowed myself to hope before. I know you well enough to know that, if you had been decided against me, you would have acknowledged it to Lady Catherine. Elizabeth laughed. Yes, you know me well. After abusing you to your face, I could have no problem abusing you to all your relations. What did you say of me that I did not deserve? My behavior to you was terrible, I cannot even think of it." "We will not argue to see whose behavior was worse," said Elizabeth. "I have been a selfish being all my life," he replied. "This was how I was from age 8 to 28. I might have remained that way if it weren't for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. You showed me that I needed to change if I was to impress you. Did you think I was impressed by you?" "Early on I did." "You must have hated me after Hunsford." "Hate you? I was angry at first, but I soon realized that I needed to change." "I'm afraid of asking what you thought of me when we met at Pemberley." "I felt nothing but surprise." "Your surprise could not be greater than mine in being noticed by you." "I hoped that you would forgive me," he replied. "Any other plan, I promise you, did not enter my head until at least half an hour after I had seen you." After walking several miles in this way, and too busy to realize, they found at last that it was time to be at home. At night, she opened her heart to Jane. "You are joking, Lizzie. Engaged to Mr. Darcy? No, it is impossible." "Oh dear, I am sure nobody else will believe me if you do not. It is true. He still loves me, and we are engaged." "No, I know how much you dislike him." "Please, forget all of that. I love him very much now. Are you pleased, Jane? He will be your brother." Nothing could give either Bingley or myself more delight. "But how long have you loved him?" "It has been coming on so slowly that I hardly know when it began. But I believe I must have started when I saw his lovely gardens at Pemberley." "Be serious, Lizzie." Lizzie finally convinced her that she was in love with Mr. Darcy. She then told her sister all he had done for Lydia. Jane could not believe such kindness, and the two spent half the night in conversation. "Oh dear," cried Mrs. Bennet, as she stood at the window the next morning. "It is that awful Mr. Darcy coming here again with our dear Bingley. Why does he always come here? Lizzie, you must go for a walk with him again, so that he does not get in the way of Bingley and Jane." During their walk, it was decided that Mr. Darcy would ask Mr. Bennet for his approval of the match that evening. Elizabeth said that she would talk to her mother. In the evening, Mr. Darcy followed Mr. Bennet to the library. He returned a little later, smiling. In a few minutes, he approached her and said a whisper, "Go to your father. He wants you in the library." Her father was walking about the room, looking serious and anxious. "Lizzie," he said, "what are you doing? Haven't you always hated him?" How she wished she had not spoken so badly about him to everyone. "Have you any other objection," said Elizabeth, "than your belief of my indifference?" "None at all, if you really like him." "I do like him," she replied, with tears in her eyes. "I love him." To complete the good impression, she then told him what Mr. Darcy had voluntarily done for Lydia. He heard her with astonishment. "Is that so? Darcy did everything. Made up the match, gave the money, and paid Wickham's debts. Well, that will save me a world of trouble and money. I will offer to pay him tomorrow. He will argue against me and tell me he loves you, and that will be the end of it." As Elizabeth left the room, he said, "If any young men come for Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am not busy." Elizabeth told her mother the news that night. On first hearing it, Mrs. Bennet sat quite still and could not say a word. After many minutes, she said, "Oh, only think. Mr. Darcy. And is it really true? Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and how great you will be. So pretty, so tall. Dear, dear Lizzie. A house in town. 10,000 a year. 3 daughters married." Happy was Mrs. Bennet on the day she got rid of her 2 oldest daughters. I wish I could say that it had the effect of making her a sensible, well-informed woman for the rest of the life, but it did not. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter very much. His affection for her took him to Pemberley often, usually when he was not expected. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherfield only a year. Living so near to her mother and relations was not easy, even for such a generous heart as Jane's. Mr. Bingley bought a house in a neighboring county next to Derbyshire, and Jane and Elizabeth were soon within 30 miles of each other. Kitty spent much of her time with her 2 older sisters. In their company, she improved greatly. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and as Mrs. Bennet was unable to sit alone, she mixed more with the world and soon came to enjoy it. As for Wickham and Lydia, they sent a letter of congratulations to Lizzie soon after the wedding. My dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. It is a great comfort to have you so rich. We are in need of a house, any place would do, of about 300 or 400 a year. However, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it, if you do not want to. Yours, Wickham. Pemberley was now Georgiana Darcy's home, and she and Elizabeth soon became as close as Darcy had hoped they would. Georgiana had the highest opinion in the world of Elizabeth, though at first she was surprised at the lively way she spoke to her brother. Lady Catherine sent Mr. Darcy a letter so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time they did not talk at all. After a time, Elizabeth asked him to reconsider, and soon Lady Catherine called on them at Pemberley. The Gardiners remained close friends of Darcy and Elizabeth. They always thanked them for bringing Elizabeth to Derbyshire, which had brought them together.
Playlet, Pride and Prejudice. The Bennet sisters enter the ballroom to find Bingley, Mr. Darcy, Miss Bingley, and Mr. and Mrs. Hurst among other guests, talking.
What a beautiful room!
Yes, it is. I hope there will be many good-looking men to dance with. This is a new dress, you know.
Look, Lydia, it is Mr. Bingley.
Good evening and welcome to you all. I hope you will have a very enjoyable time.
He is very handsome. And such a gentleman, too. Oh, if only he would marry one of my daughters. Now, who is that good-looking tall gentleman over there? His name is Mr. Darcy. Apparently, he has £10,000 a year.
Truly? He is much better looking than Mr. Bingley. Shh! Sisters!
Look, though, he does not talk to anyone. He just stands there by himself, looking at everybody. How boring he is.
The dancing begins. Mr. Darcy dances one dance, then sits to watch. Mrs. Bennet and Lady Lucas look on.
Oh, dear friend, do you remember when we were young enough to dance?
Yes, it seems like a long time ago now.
Yes, I was quite the dancer in my day. Now, look at that lovely Mr. Bingley. He has talked to everyone in the room and has not sat down once. What a gentleman he is.
Yes, very different from his friend Mr. Darcy. He only danced one dance and will not talk to any of the pretty young ladies we have here. What terrible manners.
On the other side of the room, Elizabeth Bennet pauses for a rest. Mr. Bingley walks to Mr. Darcy, who stands near her. Come on, Darcy, I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. Have another dance.
I certainly will not. You know how I hate it, unless I already know my partner. It would not be appropriate at all here. Your sisters are dancing with other people, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment for me to stand up with.
How can you say such a thing? I have never seen as many pretty girls in one room before tonight. Some of them are very beautiful indeed.
No. You are dancing with the only pretty girl in the room.
Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever saw. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty and probably very nice. I'll ask my partner to introduce you.
Which one do you mean? She is not too bad, but not pretty enough for me to talk to her. I am not in the mood to dance with the girls no other man will dance with. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me.
Mr. Bingley returns to dance with Jane. Miss Bingley approaches Mr. Darcy.
Isn't this a terrible party, Darcy? I must say that I have never seen a group of less fashionable people in my life.
Yes, I agree with you.
It's funny, really, the way they dress. We are so lucky to have the latest fashions in London.
I do not care for fashion. It is more the manners that bother me. Look there. Those girls are far too young to be going to balls. What kind of mother would allow it?
Well, let us laugh at them a little. It will be a very boring evening otherwise.
Lydia and Kitty are dancing with officers.
Kitty, isn't this the most fun you have ever had? I am sure that at least 5 of the men here want to kiss me. I do love men in red coats.
Lydia, do not talk like that. But yes, it is great fun. I wish there could be a ball every week.
Mr. and Mrs. Hurst are talking together.
Darling, won't you dance another dance with me?
No, I am far too tired. I have not danced this much for months. Why don't you find someone else to be your partner?
Perhaps I will.
Scene change. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are about to go to sleep.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, I wish you could have been there. It was a lovely evening. Jane looked so beautiful. Everybody said so. Mr. Bingley could not stop looking at her. And do you know, he danced with her for 2 dances. Only think of that, my dear. He actually danced with her twice. She was the only girl in the room that he asked a second time.
Is that so?
Don't interrupt, dear. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas. I was so annoyed to see him stand up with her. However, he did not like her at all. Indeed, nobody does, you know. But he soon asked who Jane was, and got introduced, and asked her for the 2 next. Then the 2/3 he danced with Miss King, and the 2/4 with Maria Lucas, and the 2/5 with Jane again, and the 2/6 with Lizzie, and—
If he cared about my ears, he would not have danced half so much. For God's sake, say no more of his partners. I wish he had hurt his ankle in the first place.
Oh, my dear, I am quite delighted with him. He is so very handsome. And his sisters are charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace upon Mrs. Hurst's dress—
Enough!
Very well, but let me just tell you about the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. He is an awful man. He said that our Lizzie was not pretty enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to say something to him. I hate the man.